The cold autumn wind swept across the Belgian countryside on a November morning in 1940. 23-year-old Private James Henderson crouched in a muddy trench, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the bitter cold that had seeped into his bones over the past 14 hours. Around him, the remnants of his infantry unit waited in silence, their ammunition depleted, their hope fading with each passing moment. The sound of approaching German tanks grew louder, a mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. James closed his eyes and thought of his mother's kitchen in Manchester, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of the coal fire. He wondered if he would ever see home again. When the order came to surrender, it felt like a death sentence. Every soldier in that trench had heard the stories, the propaganda, the whispered rumors in the barracks, the official warnings from commanding officers. German captivity meant brutality, starvation, perhaps worse. The Geneva Convention was just words on paper, everyone said. The Nazis would show no mercy. As James raised his hands above his head and climbed out of that trench, he believed he was walking toward a nightmare from which he might never wake. But war, as history has shown us time and again, is rarely simple. It is not merely a tale of good versus evil, of heroes and villains drawn in stark contrast. War is fought by human beings, complex individuals carrying their own stories, their own values, their own capacity for both cruelty and kindness. What happened to James Henderson and thousands of British prisoners of war in German camps is a story that challenges our assumptions, a narrative that reveals the unexpected spaces where humanity persists even in the darkest of time. This is not a story that denies the very real horrors of the Second World War. The atrocities committed during those years remain some of the darkest chapters in human history. But within that darkness, there were moments of light, acts of compassion that defied military orders and risked severe consequences. This is the story of those moments, of the German guards who shared their meager rations with starving British prisoners, who slipped extra bread into coat pockets when no one was watching, who treated their captives not as enemies, but as fellow human beings caught in the machinery of war. The journey into German captivity began for most British soldiers in those desperate early years of the war. The evacuation at Dunkirk in May 1940 saved hundreds of thousands, but many were left behind. In the confused retreat, entire units found themselves cut off, surrounded, with no hope of escape. The Battle of France had been a catastrophic defeat for the Allied forces, and in its aftermath, approximately 40,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers found themselves prisoners of the Third Reich. The march into captivity was the first test of endurance. German forces, stretched thin across multiple fronts, had limited resources to transport prisoners, so they walked, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, through destroyed villages where the smoke still rose from burned buildings, past abandoned military equipment, rusting in fields, across landscapes scarred by artillery fire. The prisoners walked with empty stomachs, their uniforms dirty and torn, their boots falling apart. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others fell ill from drinking contaminated water. German guards, under pressure to move the columns quickly, showed little patience for those who could not keep pace. Yet even in those first brutal days, there were exceptions. Corporal Thomas Wright, captured near Calais, remembered a German sergeant who allowed the prisoners to rest beside a stream for an extra hour, despite orders to maintain the schedule. The sergeant, an older man with gray in his hair, had fought in the First World War. He understood what exhaustion felt like, what it meant to push the human body beyond its limits. He said nothing to the prisoners, made no grand gesture, simply let them drink their fill and wash the dust from their faces before the march continued. The destination for most British prisoners was a stalag, a prisoner of war camp designated for enlisted men and non-commissioned officers. These camps spread across Germany and occupied territories, each one housing thousands of men behind barbed wire and guard towers. Stalag 8B in Lambsdorff, Stalag Weihut IB in Marienburg, Stalag 383 in Hohenfels. The names would become etched in memory, places where time moved differently, where days blurred together in a monotonous routine of roll calls, work details, and the constant gnawing hunger that became the defining feature of captivity. When the heavy wooden gates closed behind them, the British prisoners entered a world governed by fear and uncertainty. The camps were designed to break spirit as much as to contain bodies. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across muddy compounds, each building crammed with hundreds of men sleeping on rough wooden bunks. The latrines were open trenches that stank in the summer heat and froze in winter. Washing facilities consisted of a few cold water taps, shared among thousands. Privacy did not exist. Personal space was a luxury of the past. The rations were catastrophically inadequate. A typical daily allocation consisted of a small piece of black bread, sometimes moldy, and a thin soup made from turnips or cabbage. Meat was almost unheard of. The Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, became treasured beyond gold. Each parcel contained tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, tea. Items that represented not just food, but a connection to home, a reminder that somewhere beyond the wire, people remembered them, cared about their survival. But the parcels did not arrive regularly. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing. The prisoners learned to ration their supplies carefully, making a single chocolate bar last for days, saving tins of meat for moments of desperate hunger. Under such conditions, the prisoners expected the worst from their captors. The camp commandants maintained strict discipline through threats and punishment. Attempted escapes resulted in solitary confinement in dark, cramped cells. Infractions of camp rules meant reduced rations, confiscation of Red Cross parcels, or forced standing in the cold for hours. The message was clear. Obedience was mandatory, resistance would be crushed. But the German military was not a monolithic entity. Among the guards who manned the towers and patrolled the compounds were men from all walks of life, conscripted from every corner of Germany and its territories. Young men barely out of school stood beside veterans of the First World War. Farmers served alongside factory workers. Some were devoted believers in the National Socialist ideology, eager to prove their loyalty. Others were simply men doing their duty, following orders because the alternative was unthinkable. And then there were those who saw the prisoners as something other than enemies, who looked at the gaunt faces and hollow eyes and felt something stir within them, compassion, perhaps, or simply the recognition of shared humanity. Whatever the motivation, these guards made choices that put them at risk, choices that violated regulations, choices that saved lives. Private George Miller first encountered this unexpected kindness in the winter of 1941 at Stalag Neuby. The camp, located in East Prussia, experienced brutal winters where temperatures plummeted far below freezing. The barracks offered little protection. Wind howled through gaps in the wooden walls. The men huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Many developed respiratory infections that turned serious without proper medical care. The feeling of cold became so constant that some men later said they forgot what warmth felt like. George had been assigned to a work detail, clearing snow from the camp road. The work was exhausting, his hands numb despite the thin gloves he wore. The guard supervising the detail was a man in his 40s named Friedrich, a quiet individual who rarely spoke. Friedrich had a slight limp from an injury sustained years before, which had likely kept him from frontline service. For weeks, he had overseen their work with professional detachment, neither cruel nor kind, simply present. Then, one afternoon, as the work detail took a brief rest, Friedrich approached George with something wrapped in paper. He glanced around quickly, ensuring no other guards were watching, then handed it to George. Inside was half a sausage and a thick slice of bread with butter. Real butter, not the ersatz spread that sometimes appeared in camp rations. George stared at the food, then at Friedrich, unable to speak. The guard simply nodded toward his coat pocket, a silent instruction to hide it quickly, then walked away to inspect the other workers. George learned later that Friedrich had a son who was a prisoner of war in Canada. The son had written, describing how he was treated well by his captors, how Canadian families sometimes invited prisoners to their homes for meals. Friedrich, hoping that his kindness might somehow balance the scales, that somewhere in Canada someone might show similar compassion to his boy, had decided to share what little he had. This exchange of humanity across enemy lines, this hope that mercy might beget mercy, became Friedrich's quiet rebellion against the machinery of war. Similar acts of compassion occurred throughout the camp system, though always in secret, always at risk. At Stalag 383, a guard named Hans regularly slipped extra bread to a British prisoner who was recovering from pneumonia. Hans knew the man needed additional nourishment to survive, knew that the official rations were insufficient, so every few days, when the opportunity presented itself, he would leave a small package where the prisoner could find it, never speaking of it, never acknowledging what he had done. The motivations behind these acts varied. Some guards, like Friedrich, had loved ones who were prisoners elsewhere and hoped for reciprocal treatment. Others had religious convictions that compelled them to show mercy. Some had fought in the First World War and remembered their own experiences as prisoners, the kindness they had received or the cruelty they had witnessed, and wanted to be better than what they had known. And some simply could not stand by and watch men starve when they had the means to help, however slightly. These acts of kindness created complex relationships within the camp. Prisoners learned to identify which guards might be sympathetic, which ones to approach if desperate. A carefully established network of trust developed, though it was always fragile, always dependent on secrecy. If discovered, a guard faced severe consequences. The punishment for fraternizing with prisoners or providing unauthorized assistance could mean transfer to the Eastern Front, demotion, or imprisonment in a military stockade. Yet some guards continued to help, weighing the risks against their conscience and choosing to act despite the danger. Sergeant William Patterson witnessed one of the most remarkable acts of compassion during the winter of 1942. His work detail had been sent to a nearby farm to help with winter preparations. The farmer, an elderly man whose sons were all serving in the military, needed assistance cutting and stacking firewood. The work was hard but welcome, a chance to be outside the camp, to feel useful, to move their bodies in ways that the endless waiting of camp life did not allow. The guard assigned to supervise them was a man named Otto, a schoolteacher before the war. Now wearing a uniform he seemed uncomfortable in. Otto watched them work but did not push them hard, allowing frequent breaks, sharing water from his canteen. As the day progressed, the farmer's wife emerged from the house with a large pot of soup and fresh bread. Real soup, with potatoes and vegetables and small pieces of pork. The smell alone was almost overwhelming after months of turnip water and moldy bread. The regulations were clear. Prisoners were not to receive food from civilians. The farmer's wife looked at Otto, uncertain. The prisoners held their breath, knowing that, by all military rules, this meal would be denied them. Otto paused, looked at the prisoners, then at the steaming pot of soup. He made his decision. He told the farmer's wife to serve everyone, guards and prisoners alike. They sat together, German soldiers and British prisoners, sharing a meal in the weak winter sunlight. For 30 minutes, the war seemed distant. They were just men, cold and hungry, grateful for hot soup and kindness. That evening, as they marched back to camp, Otto spoke quietly to William. He said he knew the soup violated regulations. He said he knew there could be consequences, but he could not, in good conscience, let hungry men watch while others ate. He asked William to tell the others to say nothing, to keep the incident quiet. William agreed, and the secret was kept. Otto continued to supervise their work details for months afterward, and, whenever possible, small acts of compassion followed. An extra break on particularly cold days, a turned back when a prisoner pocketed a potato from the field. These were not grand gestures, but in the context of camp life, they meant everything. The sharing of rations took many forms. Some guards brought food from home, items their families had managed to save from their own limited supplies, a few slices of bread, an apple, a small piece of cheese. These were treasures in a time of rationing, when even German civilians struggled with shortages. To give food away meant someone at home would have less. Yet some guards did so anyway, driven by something deeper than self-preservation. Corporal David Hughes remembered a young guard, barely 19, who often had guard duty in the evening. The young man, whose name David never learned, would sometimes toss a package over the barbed wire into the compound after dark. Inside would be whatever he had managed to save from his own dinner. It was never much: a piece of sausage, a hard roll, sometimes just a handful of biscuits, but it was offered freely at personal cost, and David and his barracks mates came to look for those packages, to watch for the shadow moving along the fence in the darkness. These exchanges created moral complexities that the prisoners struggled to understand. How could they reconcile the kindness of individual guards with the system those guards served? How could they accept help from men who wore the uniform of their enemy, who worked for a regime responsible for terrible acts? Some prisoners refused to accept any help from German guards on principle, seeing it as collaboration or weakness. Others argued that survival required setting aside such considerations, that starving to death to maintain ideological purity served no purpose. Private Robert Taylor wrestled with these questions throughout his captivity. He had lost friends in battle, had seen the destruction wrought by German forces across Europe. His hatred for the Nazi regime burned fierce and uncompromising. Yet when a guard named Klaus began leaving small packages of food near Robert's workstation, Robert faced a choice: accept the help and compromise his principles, or refuse and continue to suffer from the inadequate rations that were slowly destroying his health. Robert chose to survive. He accepted the food, and with it, a more nuanced understanding of the situation. Klaus was not the Nazi ideology personified. He was a 35-year-old bookkeeper from Hamburg who had been conscripted, who had a wife and daughter he longed to return to, who found himself in a position where he could either follow regulations strictly or exercise small mercies. Klaus chose mercy, not as a political statement, but as a human response to suffering he had the power to alleviate, however slightly. This realization that individuals could be separated from the systems they served, that humanity could persist even in institutional evil, was perhaps one of the most important lessons of the prisoner experience. It did not excuse the atrocities of the war. It did not diminish the very real cruelty that many prisoners suffered at the hands of brutal guards, but it added complexity to the narrative, reminded them that even in the darkest times, choices remained, and some people chose kindness over cruelty, compassion over indifference. The winter of 1943 brought new hardships. Food supplies across Germany were strained as the war turned increasingly against the Axis powers. Rations for both guards and prisoners were reduced. The cold seemed even more penetrating than previous winters. Illness spread through the crowded barracks. Men who had endured years of captivity found their strength fading, their bodies unable to sustain themselves on the meager provisions. The death rate in the camps increased, though such losses were rarely recorded properly, swept away in the chaos of a war that was beginning to consume everything. It was during this terrible winter that Sergeant Albert Shaw experienced an act of kindness that likely saved his life. Albert had developed a severe respiratory infection that left him weak and feverish. The camp medical facilities were overwhelmed, understaffed, lacking in basic medicines. Albert lay on his bunk, drifting in and out of consciousness, while his friends did what little they could to keep him comfortable. A guard named Herman, who had noticed Albert's absence from roll call, made inquiries. When he learned of Albert's condition, Herman took a risk that could have cost him dearly. He brought medicine from the guard's own medical supplies, antibiotics that were strictly controlled, meant only for German personnel. Herman smuggled the medicine into the barracks, showed Albert's friends how to administer it, and returned several times to check on the patient's progress. Albert recovered slowly over the following weeks, his fever breaking, his strength gradually returning. He knew he owed his life to Herman's intervention. Years later, after the war, Albert would try to find Herman, to thank him properly, to let him know what his actions had meant. But the chaos of Germany's defeat, the mass displacement of populations, the destruction of records made such searches nearly impossible. Albert never found him, but he never forgot, and he spent the rest of his life telling the story, ensuring that Herman's courage would be remembered. The relationships between prisoners and sympathetic guards sometimes evolved into genuine friendships, as much as such friendships could exist across the divide of captivity. Shared cigarettes led to shared conversations. Guards who spoke English would sometimes discuss philosophy, literature, music, these conversations provided mental stimulation that was as necessary for survival as physical sustenance. The endless monotony of camp life could break a man's spirit as surely as hunger could break his body. To engage in intellectual discourse, to debate ideas, to discuss the world beyond the wire, these were small rebellions against the dehumanizing nature of captivity. Private Henry Cooper formed such a connection with a guard named Stephen, a former university student whose studies had been interrupted by conscription. Stephen loved poetry and would sometimes recite verses from Goethe or Schiller during the quiet moments of guard duty. Henry, an avid reader before the war, found these exchanges profoundly meaningful. They would discuss the romantic poets, argue about the nature of art, debate philosophy. Stephen brought Henry books from his personal collection, forbidden transactions that both men kept secret. These books, passed in quiet moments when no one watched, became Henry's lifeline to sanity, a reminder that beauty and thought still existed beyond the ugliness of war. Not all guards who showed compassion did so consistently. Some had moments of kindness that alternated with strict adherence to regulations or even occasional harshness. The pressures they faced were immense. They were caught between their natural human responses and the demands of military discipline, between personal conscience and institutional authority. A guard who was sympathetic one day might be harsh the next, influenced by the presence of superior officers, by their own stress and exhaustion, by the constant fear of being accused of weakness or disloyalty. Private Jack Morrison observed this complexity in a guard named Wolfgang. Most days, Wolfgang was professional but fair, neither cruel nor particularly kind. But on certain days, usually when Wolfgang received letters from home, he became withdrawn and irritable, enforcing rules strictly, showing no flexibility. Jack later learned that Wolfgang's hometown had been heavily bombed by Allied air raids. His family had survived, but their home was destroyed, and they were living as refugees with relatives. The letters brought news that weighed heavily on Wolfgang, filling him with anger and grief that spilled over into his duties. Jack could not blame him, could not expect kindness from a man grappling with such pain. Yet on other days, when Wolfgang's mood lifted, small mercies would return: an overlooked infraction, a shared cigarette, a warning before an inspection so the prisoners could hide forbidden items. This variability in treatment reflected the larger truth of the camps. The experience of captivity was not uniform. It varied by camp, by individual guards, by circumstances that shifted with the progress of the war. Some prisoners suffered terribly at the hands of brutal guards who seemed to delight in cruelty. Others found themselves under the watch of men like Friedrich, Hans, Otto, Klaus, Hermann, and Stefan, men who maintained their humanity despite the uniform they wore. And many experienced a mixture of both, learning to navigate the unpredictable landscape of camp life, identifying opportunities for kindness, and avoiding moments of danger. As the war progressed into 1944, conditions in the camps deteriorated further. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, disrupting supply lines throughout Germany. Food became increasingly scarce. The Red Cross parcels arrived less frequently. Rations were cut again and again until the daily provisions barely qualified as sustenance. Prisoners lost weight rapidly, their bodies consuming themselves. Men who had been healthy and strong before capture now looked like walking skeletons, their clothes hanging loose, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. The guards were hungry too. German civilians were starving. The entire nation was collapsing under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. In such circumstances, acts of generosity became even more remarkable, even more costly. To share food when there was barely enough for oneself required extraordinary compassion. Lance Corporal Michael Wright witnessed such an act in the spring of 1944. His work detail was clearing rubble in a bombed town near the camp. The destruction was total. Buildings reduced to piles of broken masonry, streets impassable with debris. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air weeks after the raid. The prisoners worked slowly, weakened by hunger, their hands blistered, their backs aching. The guard supervising them, a man named Ernst, had been with the detail for several months. Ernst was a quiet man who seemed older than his years, worn down by circumstances Michael could only guess at. At midday, When the work paused for a brief rest, Ernst reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle. Inside was his lunch, a piece of bread, a bit of cheese, a hard sausage. Not much, but everything Ernst would have to eat that day. Ernst looked at the prisoners sitting exhausted in the rubble and made a decision. He broke the bread into pieces and distributed it among them. He cut the sausage into thin slices and shared it. He kept nothing for himself. Michael tried to refuse, understanding what this meant, but Ernst insisted. He said something in German that Michael did not fully understand, but the meaning was clear in the gesture. They were all hungry. They were all suffering. To hoard food while others starved was unconscionable. Ernst worked the rest of the day with an empty stomach, and when the detail returned to camp that evening, he went to his quarters without dinner because he had given his away. Michael never forgot that moment. He would later say it was one of the most profound experiences of his captivity, a reminder that even in the midst of total war, even as nations attempted to destroy each other, individual human beings could still choose compassion over self-interest, could still recognize their common humanity. The final year of the war brought chaos to the camp system. As Allied forces advanced from the west and Soviet forces from the east, the Germans began evacuating camps, forcing prisoners on brutal forced marches through winter conditions. These marches, later known as the Death Marches, cost thousands of lives. Prisoners already weakened by years of captivity were driven forward without adequate food, water, or shelter. Many collapsed and perished. Those who could not keep pace were sometimes left behind, sometimes faced harsher fates. Yet even during these terrible marches, acts of compassion occurred. Guards who allowed prisoners to rest longer than ordered. Guards who looked the other way when prisoners took food from abandoned farms. Guards who, in the final days of the Reich, simply walked away, refusing to continue driving exhausted men forward, choosing humanity over orders even as their world collapsed around them. Private Samuel Green was on one of these marches in January 1945. The column stretched for miles, thousands of prisoners shuffling through snow and ice. The guards were nervous, knowing the war was lost, uncertain of their own fate. Samuel had dysentery and could barely walk. He knew he was slowing down, knew that every step took effort. He was not sure he could sustain. He expected to be left behind, expected the worst. But the guard nearest to him, a young man named Peter, who could not have been more than 20, stayed close. Peter helped Samuel when he stumbled, let him lean on his rifle for support during brief rest, shared water from his canteen. Peter did not have to do this. He could have let Samuel fall and moved on. Other guards were doing exactly that. But Peter, for reasons Samuel never fully understood, chose to help. They walked together for 3 days. Peter never spoke much, just offered what assistance he could. On the third night, the column stopped in a barn. Peter brought Samuel extra straw to lie on, helped him to a corner where he would be slightly warmer. The next morning, Peter was gone, reassigned to another part of the column. Samuel never saw him again. But those 3 days of unexpected kindness kept Samuel alive, gave him the strength to continue until liberation came 2 months later. The liberation of the camps revealed the full extent of the suffering prisoners had endured. Allied forces, advancing into Germany, encountered the stalags and freed the emaciated men behind the wire. Medical personnel were shocked by the condition of the prisoners, by the evidence of prolonged starvation and neglect. For many, recovery would take months or years. Some never fully recovered, carrying the physical and psychological scars of captivity for the rest of their lives. In the aftermath of the war, the prisoners faced the complex task of making sense of their experiences. The world wanted clear narratives of good and evil, heroes and villains, and certainly there were villains. Camp commandants who had enforced brutal conditions, guards who had beaten and mistreated prisoners, officials who had prioritized ideology over humanity. These men faced justice at war crimes tribunals. But what of the guards who had shown kindness? How should they be remembered? This question troubled many former prisoners. Some argued that any kindness shown within an evil system could not erase participation in that system. Others believed that acknowledging the compassion of individual guards was not the same as forgiving the regime they served, that recognizing nuance and complexity was essential to understanding the full truth of what happened. Many former prisoners, once they had recovered their health and returned to their lives, felt compelled to tell these stories, not to minimize the horrors of the war, but to bear witness to the moments of humanity they had witnessed. They wrote letters, gave interviews, published memoirs. They wanted the world to know about Friedrich and his shared sausage, about Hermann and his smuggled medicine, about Ernst and his given-away lunch, about Peter and his steadfast support during the march. These stories served multiple purposes. They complicated the simplistic narratives that reduced the war to pure evil versus pure good. They reminded people that individual choices matter, that even in the most constrained circumstances, humans retain agency, can decide to be cruel or kind, to follow orders blindly or to exercise mercy when possible. And they offered a kind of hope, a demonstration that humanity could survive even in situations designed to destroy it. Private James Henderson, whose capture we witnessed at the beginning of this story, survived his captivity. He returned to Manchester, to his mother's kitchen and the smell of fresh bread, to the warmth of the coal fire. But he carried with him memories of the camp, of the hunger and cold and fear. And he carried memories of a guard named Friedrich, who had given him half a sausage on a winter day when both men were hungry, when compassion cost something real but was offered anyway. James lived for another 40 years after the war. He married, had children, worked as a mechanic, led an ordinary life. But he never forgot Friedrich. He told the story to his children and grandchildren. He wrote it down so it would not be lost. He wanted future generations to know that even in the darkest times, even across the lines of war and ideology, human beings could recognize each other's humanity, could choose kindness over cruelty, could share their bread with those who hungered. The story of British prisoners of war in Germany is ultimately a story about choice. The choices made by nations to go to war. The choices made by individuals caught in that war. The choices made by guards who could have followed regulations strictly, but decided instead to show mercy. These were not grand gestures that changed the course of history. They were small acts, performed in secret at personal risk, without expectation of recognition or reward. But for the prisoners who received these acts of kindness, they meant survival. They meant hope. They meant the difference between despair and the will to endure. War reveals both the worst and the best of human nature. It shows our capacity for terrible cruelty, for violence, for inhumanity. But it also shows our capacity for compassion, for sacrifice, for maintaining our moral core even when systems and circumstances pressure us to abandon it. The guards who shared their rations with British prisoners were not heroes in the conventional sense. They did not win battles or change policies, but they made choices that affirmed the value of human life, that rejected the dehumanization war demands, that recognized the enemy as fellow human beings deserving of basic dignity. In remembering the Second World War, we must remember all of it, the terrible losses, the immense suffering, the atrocities that must never be forgotten or repeated. But we must also remember the moments of light within the darkness, the acts of compassion that sustained hope, the individuals who chose humanity over hatred. These memories serve not to soften the harsh realities of war, but to remind us of what is possible, of what we are capable of, both in our capacity for evil and in our capacity for good. The prisoners who survived German captivity and spoke of guards who showed them kindness were not naive. They understood the system they had been trapped within. They knew the ideology that drove the regime, but they also knew that ideology is expressed through individuals, and individuals can choose to resist, even in small ways, even when resistance costs them dearly. They knew because they had witnessed it, had benefited from it, had survived because someone chose to be kind when cruelty would have been easier. Today the stalags are gone, most torn down, some preserved as memorials. The prisoners who lived through those years are now almost all departed, their memories preserved only in written accounts and recorded interviews. The guards who showed them compassion are gone as well, most dying anonymously, unknown to history. Their acts of kindness remembered only by those they helped. But the lessons remain. War is not inevitable. It is not some force of nature beyond human control. It is the result of choices made led by leaders and followed by population. And within war, even in its most terrible manifestations, individuals retain the power to choose. They can choose cruelty or compassion. They can dehumanize or recognize humanity. They can follow orders blindly or find ways to exercise mercy within the constraints they face. The story of British prisoners of war who expected brutality but sometimes found kindness instead is not a happy story. Too much suffering occurred. Too many died. Too many were broken by their experiences. But it is a story that contains hope, not the naive hope that war can be made gentle, but the deeper hope that even in war, humanity can persist. That even when systems are designed to destroy compassion, individuals can choose to preserve it. That even when nations are enemies, people can recognize their common humanity and act accordingly. In the end, perhaps this is the most important lesson. We remember the acts of cruelty so we can work to prevent them. But we also remember the acts of compassion so we can aspire to them. We remember the guards who could have been cruel but chose kindness. We remember the shared rations, the smuggled medicine, the quiet gestures of mercy that cost their givers dearly but saved lives, sustained hope, and demonstrated that humanity, however battered and constrained, can survive the worst that history throws at it. The war ended. The camps emptied, the prisoners went home, but the memories remained, and with them, a complicated truth about human nature, about choice, about the persistence of compassion even in places designed to extinguish it. And that truth, however uncomfortable, however complex, is worth remembering, worth telling, worth preserving for future generations who must make their own choices about what kind of world they will create, what kind of people they will be, and whether they will choose kindness or cruelty when that choice is placed before them.